Spencer Klavan, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Ben.
So you have a new book that's coming out that you've been working on based around a lot of things I think will be familiar to people who are listeners to your podcast, Young Heretics, and are familiar with some of your other written work called How to Save the West. How do you save the West?
It's an ambitious proposition, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, I kind of, I was a little nervous to call the book that because obviously it sounds like I'm offering like the prescription for saving Western civilization. And in some sense I am, but maybe not in the political or, grand design sense that a lot of people are looking for. I think that's a cause of a lot of our despair right now as you look at what's going on, in American politics, in the world more generally, wars overseas. And these crises seem so much bigger than any kind of input we could have. I think a lot of people feel extremely powerless and they feel like they've lost ownership over their own civilization, their own country. And so the reason I wrote this book is that I wanted people to understand that the West, as a grand tradition of, the inheritance of Athens and Jerusalem, is actually not dependent on your vote going the right way or this particular political battle coming out correctly. Because as a matter of fact, these traditions have survived enormous catastrophes, worse than even anything we currently are fearing, I would say. And so how do you save the West? Well, you become the West. You take these traditions into your home. You take ownership of them. You let nobody talk you out of them. And you let nobody say to you that, oh, those great books, they're kind of musty. They're on a shelf. They're for experts. The reason I wrote the book is I wanted people to understand that, these great ideas that come down to us from the traditions of Athens and Jerusalem, they're really for you. They're about your concerns. How do I wake up in the morning and live a good life? How do I raise a good family? And I think that, we've kind of lost touch with that because we're thinking in terms of, well, how do I, wrestle the election into the right position or what have you. But a lot of the problems we're up against are actually more primal than that. And so each section of the book deals with something that's in the news a lot, like, say, transgenderism, which is one of the big hot button topics I deal with. But it kind of tries to pull back the camera and say, okay, we're in this era of radical high tech. All these things seem to be happening in our schools that for a lot of people just suddenly, everybody went crazy. What's going on here that's deeper than that? And so I take that, into the question of, ancient theories of the body and not just transgenderism, but transhumanism. And some of these forces that are rearing their head, they're very ancient. And that means that the answers to them are quite ancient, but at the same time can be incorporated into your daily life, right? Get out, do a little exercise. I mean, that's sounds like simple advice, but it actually comes with the backing of thousands of years worth of wisdom. And I think incorporating that wisdom into our own manageable human-sized lives is how we begin to take back agency over a question like saving the West.
Talk to me about one chapter in particular. You have the war over reality, and the way that that's defined in our current media conversation tends to be through the lens of conspiracy theories and that kind of thing. But you're talking about something that's quite a bit deeper than that. Tell me what you mean in terms of the war over reality that we're facing here right now.
Absolutely. Well, I think the conspiracy theory stuff is like a little ripple on the surface of a really deep current that's going through our civilization right now. And in the book, I start out with a bunch of kind of news stories that people will probably be familiar with. I talk about, Facebook's transition into Meta, becoming this virtual reality company. But I also talk about, the concern over quote unquote post-truth politics, which became a buzzword in the media when Donald Trump rose to the fore, but which really was a much older phenomenon that we've been struggling with for as long as I've been alive. I mean, we had the Bush memos that were quote unquote fake but accurate. We've had Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talking about being morally right rather than factually correct. And so what you're seeing in all of these domains is uncertainty about the question of reality. What's real? What counts as real? And in some cases, it's not even an uncertainty so much as a denial that the concept of reality is even useful at all, right? I mean, if we just get rid of that, some people say, we can live in a paradise of imagined virtual reality. We can kind of, push forward to our utopia, either by being, morally correct if factually wrong, or by building some tech machine that's going to, take our brains into a perfect headspace. And the reason that keeps falling apart or keeps looking so dystopian is because it's actually going back to one of the deepest questions in Western philosophy. When Western philosophy begins with Socrates and his encounters with what he called the sophists, or Plato called the sophists, they were arguing over this very question. Is there anything that's real, whether we like it or not? Is there anything that just is, and we can't change it by just merely willing it away or talking it away? Or is the world just a pure imposition of power? And that's what you see now with these language games, right? Oh, men can be women if I just say so, if it's my identity and so forth. This is, again, a very ancient impulse to say there is nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so, as Shakespeare's Hamlet says in his madness. And so the first, fifth of the book is devoted to recovering a sense that if we want to have a meaningful life at all, we actually can't just live in a world of pure imagination. There's got to be something, some bedrock somewhere that is the same whether we, choose to wish it away, whether we invent neologisms to talk it away or not. And really the whole rest of the book is devoted to exploring, where is that reality that we can hold to as all these other things change.
How do we navigate a world in which the phrase "my truth" has become so ever present, in the sense that, the world revolves around your definition of it as opposed to having some firm definition?
That's a great question. And I talk about the my truth idea in this reality section because, obviously conservatives hear that and we immediately know there's something deeply wrong with the idea that you can just declare something to be true and make it true that way. It's an idea that comes to us in large part from these, French post-structuralists and from sort of this, late modern notion of just, there being no stable reality at all. And I think that the answer to this that you'll find in the book is maybe a little counterintuitive, because a lot of times conservatives, when they hear something like my truth, they just buckle down and they say, that's complete nonsense. Facts are just facts. They're just, pure objectivity. But one thing we can see in the world is that extreme doesn't actually work either, because that's kind of the scientistic extreme that says there's no such thing that is real except like hard, cold, physical reality. And so I think what we really need is to recover that middle ground, which used to be called subjective. And subjective becomes a bad word, from the 19th century onward, because it starts to mean like arbitrary or fanciful or imaginary. But if you actually think about what subjective means, it means it's a true thing about a human subject, right? That there's a person there on the other end of the line. And this is what you always deny when you go into, artificial reality or into these fantasies, is like other people are real. And the fact that, light is refracting through the air in the morning is very nice, but unless there's a human subject on the other end, we can't really call it a sunset. We can't say it's beautiful. And so that subjective truth, which is not something you can wish away or make up or, recreate, but actually exists in your mind, right, in your relationship to the world, that's where everything important lives, right? The beauty, memory, desire, love, all of these things we know to be true. And so one thing I'm doing a lot in the book is trying to reconnect people to their sense that that's not an illusion. It's not a fantasy that you're like chemistry set inside of a meat sack bubbled up. It's actually a reality that is deeper in some sense than the scientific reality of like billiard balls, atoms bouncing off of one another. Subjective truth in the robust sense, I think, is what we ought to be reclaiming to counteract this idea of my truth, which is really just arbitrary truth. And that's something very different altogether.
There's a thread of thought that exists among some conservatives and among some on the left that essentially functions as an indictment of the Enlightenment era values that flowed into many aspects of the founding of America. One that seems to have gained a bit more purchase in recent years. And perhaps it's an oversimplification, but the argument basically goes, well, those values were fine for the country for a certain amount of time, but they depended on a faithful and faith-filled group of people, of communities that were bound to that faith-based knowledge, or whose leadership was guided by that type of worshipfulness. You think back to some of the speeches, for instance, that Calvin Coolidge gave on this front, where he talks about we live in an era of science and the accumulation of knowledge and all these great advancements, but that these will turn into a barren scepter in our hands if we lose sight of the altar fires that were guiding, our founders. That's just, one expression of it. But it seems to have really gotten hold of a lot of people's thought processes these days, in part because of whether it's a critique from someone like Ross Douthat of decadence in our day and age, or whether it's a critique from a more, critics would call it authoritarian faith focus, or people who want to go in that direction. I'm curious as to your thoughts on that whole phenomenon, and whether, when you were writing this book, an aspect of it was to defend the West to the people who have benefited from Western values the most.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it was very much on my mind. Absolutely. There's even a more pessimistic version of the argument that you just articulated, and that is that Enlightenment liberalism was doomed from the start, that it's an inherently corrosive ideology because it's sort of premised on, neutrality or even transgression, right? Everything is permitted, so long as we, keep certain bounds on. As long as we don't come to blows, we can make any argument that we want. And it's necessarily, therefore, going to always favor arguments that are more kind of anti-traditionalists, that come up with new ways of transgressing, that question authority, right? And a lot of the bumper stickers that I think I grew up with, at least, are kind of caricatures in this way. Question authority as if that were inherently a good thing, as if you're inherently virtuous for breaking away from the past and so forth. Patrick Deneen is somebody that comes up a lot. He wrote that book, Why Liberalism Failed. I think that there is certainly an element of truth to arguments like that. That element of truth is in some sense why I wrote the book, which is to say, it's absolutely true, as Coolidge suggested, that these traditions of open discourse, of freedom, of civility, right? These are kind of like jewels in a crown. They don't really make a lot of sense, and they actually can't stand on their own without a thick cultural backing behind them. And if you take away all of the, cultural assumptions that somebody like John Stuart Mill lived with, or even, go back to Milton, he too is kind of making some of these arguments within that context. If you take that away, if you take that faith backing away, then liberalism kind of does become just an acid bath, right? Becomes this thing that teaches you to revile the very thing that gave you everything you have. And that is undeniably the situation we're in. That's why I wrote the book, is to explain to people, look, you think that you're going to be in this utopia of freedom and bliss and civility and tolerance if you just jettison the past with all of its prejudices and superstitions. And a big argument in the book, the opening of the book, is, the reason that you even think freedom is a good thing, or civility is a good thing, is because of those prejudiced, so-called superstitious, great books from the past. So I think that is a very powerful argument. What I also think is true, though, is that we seem to be bouncing back and forth between two options. Either America is this completely deracinated, faith-free neutrality zone where nothing that even smacks of tradition or anything like that is allowed into the public square, or and this is again a caricature, we need a sort of state-imposed list of religious rules. Like we need to really, shape the state according to some religious doctrine. And I actually think that the vision of the founders is right in the middle of those two things. And this is what I end the book by kind of arguing. There is something new in the founding that is the kind of creation of that environment for Enlightenment liberalism in its best form to thrive. And it's theist. It's not that it doesn't involve setting up any particular faith, but it does mean that our founding ideals don't make any sense without a vision of a created universe that's ordered according to a creating mind. And so I think a lot of the times people like me who are more on the faith side of things can get very, we get ahead of ourselves. We start banging people over the head with the Nicene Creed. And what people are really up against is, well, is there such a thing as absolute truth at all? Okay, well, if there is absolute truth, where does it come from? Who arbitrates it? And I do think there's no escaping those questions for America. If you're going to be, living in America as founded, you have to actually be operating within a context that says, okay, maybe I, don't have to be Catholic or don't have to be Protestant, but for any of these ideas to make sense, they have to take place within an ordered universe, and ordered universes only come about if they are ordered by somebody. So yeah, there is an argument for faith of that level in the book, but I don't think that I think that we're struggling with questions that are so basic and so primal that we almost don't understand that that's the question we're asking. We're really asking, is there a God? Can we believe? And I think the answer has to be yes.
We talked previously about the rise of the use of multiverses within the video and sort of all of TV and movies and the like as a storytelling device. How does that connect to the phenomenons that you are identifying in this book? Is the appeal of multiverse type approaches to telling stories these days, does that have some origin in a discontent or a feeling of a lack of strong reality-based approaches to the way that we view our world?
I think that's absolutely right. In fact, the multiverse is in the center of the book. It's kind of the middle section. And that essay that you and I talked about in the Claremont Review of Books was in some ways, derived from the core argument there. And that section is really about what we call the culture wars, which is another thing that people will recognize from the news cycle. Every day we seem to have some new scandal that outrages conservatives and makes liberals, gleeful with transgression. And, I talk in the book, for instance, about the Netflix release of this movie Cuties, which was this French film that they splashed these very sexually provocative images of young girls, as part of their promotional material. What I begin by saying in that section is, okay, so maybe your typical understanding of the culture wars is the right wants morality, public morality, and the left wants, transgression and a free-for-all. And maybe that was a sort of vaguely accurate description of the situation several decades ago. But when you come up against something like that Cuties fight, or, the fight over representation, say, where we need to have people of certain, colors and certain sexualities, on screen, you're actually not up against libertines anymore. You're up against two competing moral visions of the world. Everybody, since there has been literary criticism, everybody who thinks about art has known that art contains a moral vision of the world. There's no escaping it. All art that is great really depicts, things as being not just happening, but as being good and bad, evil, painful, chaotic, joyous, and so forth. And so what we're really doing in our culture wars is we're fighting over whose moral vision of the world is more accurate, beautiful, ennobling, and true. And the left has a vision of the world which is sexually permissive in every level, but incredibly locked down on the levels of, of ideology, of speaking ill or of joking about certain protected classes. And they want that enshrined in art. And the right has a moral vision of of the world, which I think is more accurate, which is that, that good and evil are real and exist, and that tradition has value and meaning. And so, that's the fight that we're in. And in that fight, it's striking to me that one of our big, artistic creations is the multiverse, which is effectively an image of chaos. It effectively means that no actions have any consequences, that life is just matter, right? That we're just bouncing off of one another. And I go into this in the book, but, the answer to this really comes right out of the ancient tradition of literary criticism, which is the tradition of mimesis. This whole thing arises with when Dawkins invents the meme, which is basically the kind of evolutionary model of all things, that everything just evolves and replicates over and over again. And so it makes sense that you get from there into this kind of multiverse universe. And my question is just, well, okay, if you're constantly copying copies of copies, where's the original? Is there an actual real life that we are trying to depict when we do art? Or are we just trying to kind of force a new vision of utopia into the world? And so it comes back again to this same debate, right? Is there something true and good that we're trying to depict in art? Or are we just trying to transform the world into some kind of, vision of post-sexual utopia? And I think, I can tell which one makes better art. And I think that's an indicator of which one is closer to reality.
So you may have anticipated this next question, which is, what is your perspective on the development of AI-based, AI-created art as something that people are really leaning into in this moment? You look at things like Midjourney, for instance, where you can very quickly, in a matter of seconds, put in a request, and depending on how well you refine your request, the AI can spit out something that is at least an approximation of what you've asked it to do. I've had some people tell me that this is really an act of illustration as opposed to an act of creating art. But there are some people who really believe that this has, enormous promise for the future. And there are also artists who say that they use it in order to find inspiration for works that they then create. Right. What do you think about that development? And is it something that's a positive, or is it also, again, indicative of kind of the chaos of our current moment?
It's so interesting. ChatGPT and Lensa got really big the last couple of months, and it's funny to watch some of the things that I wrote about back when I wrote the book, advance into greater fruition, because that stuff all happened after I finished the book. But it really is, I think, it not to say it proves me right, but it certainly shows that the things I'm talking about in the book are at the center of our problems. Another thing that happened right after I wrote the book is this guy. I think his name was Lemoine, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, at Google, decided that Google's language learning software was alive and had a soul. Mm-hmm. And to me, that is the most interesting little episode to come out of all of these developments, because that is to put your finger on the question. I am not a tech pessimist in the sense that I think, all of these developments are wholly bad. But I do think that when you build a machine that spits out human-sounding words, and then you say that machine is human, has a soul, you are demonstrating a fundamentally wrong idea about what people are. And that is because you have been trained out of that subjective sense, that valuing the subjective truth of the world, right? That when you have an inner experience, when you see something as beautiful, not just you can spit out code that describes something as beautiful, but that qualitatively in your mind, you are having that experience. That is when you are being human, and that's the whole point of everything. Why should it matter? I mean, let's imagine, for instance, that all human beings disappear from the earth tomorrow, and Lensa AI keeps automatically spitting out beautiful things. We know intuitively that would be an empty and useless world. There would be no use for that beauty. So for me, the question is less about who's making, what kind of machine is making the art. But why does the art matter at all? And then you ask that question, you'll realize that it's because somebody is having an inner experience of the art that the machine can never reproduce. People don't understand. We're not even getting closer to machines having that experience. It's not like we're kind of giving them that experience and then they're going to really come online later. All we're doing is making them better and better at imitating the behavior of something that has a human experience. And since that's true, we are going to, again, have to ask ourselves, like, what is a human being? Why does it matter that a human should exist in the world at all? Because the answer to all of these questions lies right in there. And so, yeah, like, AI is going to get better and better. It's going to do some things that are scary and some things that are really beautiful. But we are going to be the ones who are going to have to code the AI, purchase the products, right? We are going to make those decisions. And right now it seems to me like we don't know why. We're just sort of making those decisions at random. And that's the problem. What we ought to be saying is, okay, we are humans, right? We are the thing that makes the world matter. Our machines are even saying that a machine is good at something is based on a human subjective experience, right? The human reality of our perception of the world. And preserving that is just the same thing as saving the West, because it's the same thing as preserving humanity. So yeah, I'm not against AI per se, but I'm against literally idolizing it. That is to say, shaping a machine and then calling it a god or calling it something with a soul. That seems like a serious problem.
Let's go out on this. We live in an era in which the level of medication for Westerners has achieved new heights, meaning mood-altering medication of all manner of variety. Mostly for people who have difficulty coping with the world, and are prescribed it by therapists or people like that. It's an odd phenomenon, but it also seems to be something that is prevalent across society. And even if you can't afford to do it in an official medical sense, then there are ways to get around that and do it in the less legal senses. People just take these mood altering medications. Some of them are more dangerous than others, and they kind of go through life in somewhat of a haze. I wonder what your thoughts are on why that's happening and what can change in order to get us off of these medications that some people basically take forever. They take it for their entire lives.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, there's this Christmas story that Charles Dickens wrote called The Haunted Man and a Ghost's Bargain. And it's about 1848, I think he wrote it. So way before a lot of these drugs that we're talking about. But the main character in it is a chemist, which is to say he's a chemistry professor. So an expert in these very questions, right? In tinkering with the chemical reactions in the body and in the outside world. And he's tormented by the memory of his suffering. He has a betrayal in his past that he's agonizing over, and a ghost offers to erase the memory of his suffering. And of course, the Christmas story, the Christmas lesson is that when he takes that bargain, he's cut off from compassion. He's cut off from the delight of music, which is so bound up with, melancholy and sorrow. And he just can't connect to anything human because he's lost his sense that, we live in this veil of tears. And I certainly think that the prevalence of those drugs. I mean, it's not that you might not have a certain disorder that would, in certain cases, you might not have a disorder that would need medication. But the extreme overprescription of those drugs speaks to an idea about humanity that is simply false. Namely, that we are made to configure our atoms and our neurons in the most pleasurable possible way. That our purpose on this earth is to just have the nicest experience. And nice experiences just mean feeling good. And to me, this is obviously an unhuman and an unsatisfying way of life. And so the pessimist answer to your question is, well, people just eventually realize that this isn't going to bring them into the utopia that they hope. The optimist answer to your question is for people like you and me to be saying to people who are suffering and struggling in these ways, how is it working out for you to dull that pain, to blunt that pain, right? The one key that I talk about a lot in the book is, people are doing this because they have nobody around them to say them nay, right? Our communities are so thinned out in this country a lot of the time that people don't have somebody around them to say, this is hurting you. And instead of taking those drugs, come sit by me, right? Come and share this sorrow with me. And in that human connection, you'll go through the sorrow into a deeper sense of, what you are and what the world is, because that's redeeming, right? And so I end the book by just saying, actually spending time IRL with people, is perhaps the single most underrated way of recovering, what's great about our society. The human beings are not going to be erased. They're not going to be uploaded. They're not going to be, outmoded by some new machine. And so what we ought to be doing, right, is getting back together with one another, and understanding that our sorrows are just like our joys, part of the whole reason that we exist. And if there is no such reason, then there's no point to it all anyway. So yeah, I do think that recovering a sense that your sorrow is not a failure, and doesn't, it's something that is, built into you because it's part of your capacity to experience the world as a human being, who knows love and who knows joy. That's the point of it all.
Thank you so much, Spencer, for taking the time to join me today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.